I want to go to Galatians chapter 6, and I want to go ahead and read the first 10 verses, and then I'm going to break it down and unpack it a little bit for you. I really feel like my assignment today is to speak on the subject, the promise of due season. Let me kind of explain where I'm going with this before we get there. I see so many churches. I hear this word all the time. This church has potential. This city has potential. This ministry has potential. And how many of you know that there's a lot of people that have potential that never really fulfill that potential? Potential is good. Potential means there's possibilities in the future. That doesn't mean that you actually arrive there. Well, there's a spiritual principle that goes along with church's potential. You know, you can say a young man has potential. If he goes to the right school, we can hone that potential. If a young lady has great potential, if she can get the right mentor, then perhaps she can achieve her potential. So how about church potential? What if a church has great potential? How do we get there? Well, there's a spiritual principles that have to be applied in order for things to be released. God is a God of order. God is a God of appointment. I believe in divine favor. How many of you believe in divine favor? Here's what I believe favor is. I believe that favor manifests itself in strategic alignment of relationships and also strategic release of resources. I believe that when God gets ready to bless you, He brings new people into your life, aligns you strategically. That could be a mentor. That could be a millionaire. That could be a planner. That could be an encourager. But God strategically aligns you with a relationship, and then from that relationship, He also begins to release divine resources into your life, and that's what we call favor. You know, usually when we see someone walking in favor, we say everything's going good for them. But really, how is that really walked out? It's usually walked out by divine strategic relationships and then a release of resources. So we can have potential, but how many of you know that the pastor said the opportunity of a lifetime is only available in the lifetime of the opportunity? I love that phrase. But you know what potential and opportunity really is? It's when preparation meets opportunity. So what if God gives me all of these opportunities, but I'm just not ready for it? Have anyone besides me ever missed a great opportunity because you weren't prepared? I mean, the door was open. You could have walked through and you thought, man, if I'd have just read that book, if I would have just taken that course, if I would have just gone to school one more year, I mean, here's this great opportunity, and I've missed it because I wasn't ready for it. How many churches do we know that are getting ready to come into a place called due season, which is a promise place of God? It's an appointed time for a church, a ministry. God did not call us to have clubs and you know, these social gatherings for churches. He called us to win the world. And on Easter Sunday, do you realize that right now in America that only 17.7% of Americans go to church on Sunday? Do you realize that? We are a mission field. We're no longer this Christian superpower in the world anymore. Brazil is 50% Christian. The country of Brazil is 50% Christian. We're only 17% Christian, and that includes Catholics. That's not evangelical. That includes the Catholics in America. 17.7% of people are going to church in America. More people are going to get saved on Easter Sunday than any other Sunday of the year. And I'm so glad to see people inviting people to the house of God, because we've got a big job to do. God did not call us into ministry so that we could just gather and sing songs and preach sermons and just, you know, live good lives. We're a force to be reckoned with. We are filled with the power of the Holy Spirit, and we are assigned to go into the world and change communities, change schools, change environments, change colleges, change families, change neighborhoods. We are change agents in this world. But all of this is done in a supernatural rhythm, and that rhythm comes from the appointed times of God. So there's an appointment for every ministry. So God writes to the church of Galatia through the Apostle Paul, and he says to them that there's this season called due season. But he gives them a prerequisite to entering due season, and then he gives them a stern warning of something that could trip them up from getting there. So let's start in verse 1, Galatians chapter 6, verse 1. Brethren, if a man be overtaken in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, considering yourself, lest you should also be tempted. Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. For if anyone thinks himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. But let each one examine his own work, and then he will have rejoicing in himself alone and not another. For each one must bear his own load. Go to the next screen and let's look at verse 6. Let him who is taught the word share in all good things with him who teaches. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, that will he also reap. For he who sows to the flesh will of the flesh reap corruption. He who sows to the Spirit will of the Spirit reap everlasting life. And here's the verse that I really want you to take notice of, so I've highlighted that for you. And let us not grow weary while doing good. You know, I always ask the Lord for a confirmation that this is the right sermon, and I was so thrilled when Pastor quoted that in his prayer. He didn't know I was going to preach on this, but whenever he quoted that in his prayer, I thought, that's it. That's the word of the Lord. That confirmed it for me. So let us not grow weary while doing good, for in due season, that's that appointed time, we shall reap. Everybody say the word shall. See, now God is not a man that he can lie. So there's a spiritual principle here that if we push forward into due season, there is an appointed, that word there, due season, literally in the Greek means appointed time. There is an appointed harvest. I don't know if you've done any study on the feast of Israel. You know, there's a spring feast and a fall feast. And how many of you know that God chose the day for Jesus' resurrection, right? So we call it Easter, but God is the one that chose the day for resurrection. It's right around the spring feast of Passover and unleavened bread, and Jesus resurrected on the feast of first fruits because he was the first fruits of the resurrection. Well, God appointed all of this because there is something unique in the spiritual atmosphere in spring and fall of every year that brings in a spiritual harvest. It's amazing how the world lies dormant, and we're already seeing the daffodils perking their heads up through the ground, and then all of a sudden spring arrives and everything is crowned. Have you noticed? We call them blossoms, but they're all crowns. The Bible even calls them crowns. So when you see the daffodils blossoming, which is one of the first flowers, look at the next time you see one, it looks like a crown. Why? God could have made blossoms look like anything. God made them look like crowns because he wanted you and I to know that when the world is resting and dormant, that there is an appointed season for life. There's an appointed season for things to come back around. You have not been assigned, I don't care what's going on in your life, your marriage, your job, you've not been assigned to lose. You are children of the Most High King. You are heirs and joint heirs with Jesus Christ. You have been assigned to win. You have to hang in there until it comes back around again, because one season is going to lead you to the next one, but this season is there to remind us that God's appointed season says the King is coming. So the crowns perk their head up through the air and let us know that God is breathing new life into the earth again as a hope and a reminder that there is an appointed season for every minister. There's an appointed season for every marriage. There's an appointed season for every family. There's an appointed season for every business. There's an appointed season for every church. Every person that is aligning themselves with God's plan can walk out a season of due season. That's God's promise. So when you look at that, he says you can come into due season if you do not lose heart. Wow. If you don't get discouraged. Because when you get discouraged, it doesn't mean that God's through. It just means you gave up. It just means you quit too early. I don't think I'm the only one that ever quit too early on something, right? It's like, okay, if I could have just hung in there, I think it would have been okay, but I just got wore out with something and just stopped too early. And that's exactly what this passage means. So I want us to go back and walk through a few of these things. The first thing I want you to look at, if you'll go to the next screen, I want you to see a few things about life. Well, I didn't know that was going to pop up there. That's my note, but there you go. So let's go on to the next one, if you will, because I didn't think that was going to come out in the presentation. Let me walk you through a few things, first of all. First of all, life moves in seasons. How many of you know that? Life moves in seasons. I mean, nothing stays the same. Everybody wants things to stay the same. Come on, we can't even get our hair color to stay the same, right? So life is going to move in seasons. I mean, you know, the older I get, things aren't where they used to be. It's like, come on, you're supposed to be over here. Why are you here now? And that's just part of the life cycle. Things move in seasons. Your kids grow up. I loved being a dad. That's like the greatest title of all of the titles I've ever had. I fell in love with my two daughters the day they were born. My wife and I got married when we were teenagers, and I don't recommend that, but we did it and we survived some way, somehow. And so, you know, we had our daughters earlier, 2 years into our marriage. We had our first daughter. I fell head over heels in love with Brittany. Then I fell head over heels in love with Lindsay. Now they're grown up and married, and they've brought me 2 babies. And now I'm in love with Macy, and I'm in love with Brooklyn. When I introduce them, I say, this is Princess Macy the Magnificent. I say, this is Princess Brooklyn the Beautiful. Now tell them who I am. When they point at me in those cute little 5-year-old and 3-year-old voices and say, that's King Papa. I'm going to tell you, folks, when you're King Papa, you can do just about anything. When you got somebody saying that's like Mufasa, you know, when you're King Papa, you got it going on. And I've loved being a family man. It's been like the highlight of my life. But you know what? I couldn't keep those kids little forever. They grew up on me. And I did not want to be a grandpa in my 40s. I just didn't want to be one. I thought, no, that's way too young. But man, the day Macy was born, I fell in love. And now I'm the president of the club again. You know, it's like life moves in cycles. Churches move in cycles. You know, I love eras that I wish there were eras I could freeze in time. But I realized if I had have frozen those church eras in time, I would have missed a whole generation out there looking for God, because I wanted to keep God the way I found him. I wanted to sing the songs that got me to the altar, not the songs that were going to get them to the altar. I wanted to do church the way I was comfortable, not the way that the world. And here's the thing I have to remember. The whole world has changed. We can say all we want that the church has changed, but the truth is the world has changed. Your TV set has changed. You know, the way you get your haircut has changed. The way you buy groceries now has changed. Everything in the world has changed. Our cars have changed. We cannot go back. And the truth is, we cannot box God in and say he's done his best work yet when there's this whole harvest out there. What we have to do is put our eyes on the future and say, we're going to come into due season. This church has not seen its greatest days. This church has not seen its greatest altar calls. We have not seen our best revivals. We've not seen our best youth group. We've not seen our best music program. The greatest days are ahead because God is on the throne. He is the giver of life, and good things are on its way. We have to keep moving forward. And as we keep moving forward, we keep vision in front of us and life in front of us, and it puts us in places we would have never been. I realize if I would have stopped, I would have never met you. And if I would have stopped, I would have never had Macy and Brooklyn in my life. And I love that. If I would have stopped, I would have never done some of the things that God has me doing right now with my life. There's so many areas. I love them so much, I could have frozen them in time. And if I try to hang on to that and go back, it's just going to ruin the beautiful future that's out there in front of me. It's kind of like the children of Israel when they were following the cloud, and they said, this is how God moved, because this great pillar of fire would come down, and they would, I don't know if they sang Kumbaya or what they did, but, they get around the pillar of fire. I mean, imagine that. God coming down in this massive pillar of fire in the middle of the camp. He's threatening the enemy, so the enemy's not coming around. But then all of a sudden they wake up one day and the fire has moved, and they don't want to move. I liked it last night. I liked what God did here last night. And there was a group of them that stayed on the other side of the river and said, we want to stay on what God did, not get into what God's doing. So the pillar of fire moved, and they didn't go with it, and they just warmed themselves around a heap of ashes. I don't want to be where God has been. There was another story in the Bible where they ate dove's dung to stay alive. I don't want to be where the dove has been. I want to be where the dove is at. I don't want to be where the fire has been. Ashes are not the same as burning coals. I don't want to be where God has been. I want to be where God is at. I don't want to do what God did. I want to do what God is doing. That's what I want to do. So the amazing thing about following God is it just keeps getting better. And sometimes we want to lock and load. Sometimes we just want to stop and dig in and say, this is so good. Let's not leave it. It's good just the way it is. And I've been there. And honestly, I still have to resist it sometimes because I still want to sing a song that I love to sing, and I can't find anybody that wants to sing it anymore. I was so glad. I wasn't glad when Andre Crouch passed away, but I was so glad that somebody was singing Through It All again because I love that song. It's like, yes, we can sing Through It All again, So I don't know how long they'll keep singing it, but it was good for a while, and I enjoyed it because it brought back, my era. To me for a little while. We cannot go where God went. We have to go where God is going. And so in order to come into due season, there's a promise that there's an appointed time of blessing. So here's the first prerequisite, and I'm not going to stay here very long, but here's the first prerequisite for coming into due season. The first prerequisite is spiritual maturity. So he goes into verse 1. So let's go to the next verse, and let me show you this. I'm going to break this down real quick. I'm not going to stay here long. One of the things that stops us from coming into due season is that we will make a mistake, and then we will get overwhelmed from that mistake. And the Bible says, brethren, if a man is overtaken in a trespass, which is, that word there is just error, doesn't mean he's like going into blatant sin. It just means that he's made a mistake. He's messed up. You who are spiritual, restore someone in the spirit of gentleness. Okay, so let me ask you a question. This is a trick question, so I'm letting you know up front. So you might not want to answer it too loudly. How do you know if someone is spiritual? How do we know? Is it how high they raise their hand? Is it how high they jump while we're singing? How do we know if someone is spiritual? Is it because you're the first one on the altar? Or maybe the fact that they don't ever have to go to the altar means they're spiritual. How do we know if someone is spiritual? Because they give a lot of money? No. The way you tell someone if someone is spiritual is by their fruit you will know them. And one of the fruit of the Spirit is gentleness. You can tell if someone is spiritually immature if they're constantly overreacting. People who are constantly overreacting are spiritually immature. People who are constantly fear-driven and scared of everything, they're spiritually immature. I think the most dangerous people in the kingdom, and I'm a Spirit-filled believer just like you, but I think the most dangerous people in the kingdom are people who have spiritual gifts without spiritual fruit. I mean, imagine someone that thinks they have the gift of casting out demons, but they don't have love, joy, and peace in their life. Imagine what that altar call is going to look like. That's going to get downright nasty. I mean, somebody's in the altar call, and they're trying to get you to get rid of something. They have no patience. Have you ever seen an altar worker without patience? I mean, sometimes you just can't rush God in the way we want to. Sometimes, have you seen people try to force spirituality on people? Have you ever seen a mean preacher? How many of you know those two words should never go together? They should never go together. I've seen pastors that get up instead of preach, they just get up there and get mad. Work that out someplace else. The fruit of the Spirit is the real indication of how mature I am in the Lord. So if I have spiritual fruit, then I can work through spiritual gifts, but I have to have spiritual fruit. So this is what he says. In order for us to come into due season, we are going to run into issues. How many of you know every family is going to have a problem? Every church is going to have a problem. Every leader is going to have a problem. No one is going to. You can never make everybody happy all the time. How do you know that? How we handle that determines how far we go into due season. If we handle that with private meetings, and I don't know, I don't think you would ever do that, but I've heard of people in Kentucky doing that before. They have these private little meetings. They stir up all these little things, and they get on the phones and talk to people and get on Facebook and all this kind of stuff. How many of you know that's going to keep you from due season? You can't get into due season that way. The way we handle our issues gets us into due season. So he says the very first prerequisite is that we all take on this attitude of spiritual maturity and say, wait a minute, we're going to have issues, but we're going to handle them in a spirit of gentleness. Wow. How many of you know a lot of families would be better off if they could just handle things in a spirit of gentleness? You know any marriages that would fare a little better if they could just handle things in the spirit of gentleness? A few bosses would be easier to work with if they could just have a little spirit. How many of you want me to stop right now? Let's intercede for your boss to have the spirit of gentleness. A few of you are saying, please, I want to be the first one the altar call. The truth is that people that handle problems in a spirit of gentleness are so much easier to work with. Otherwise, you're walking on pins and needles all the time, and you can't even make mistakes, and that's going to happen. So he says the first thing we have to do to arrive into due seasons, we have to allow people to make mistakes. Pastor didn't go into my background, so I just want to tell you just one little thing about me is that I spent 27 years of my life building a church. I went there, the church had 53 people, and the church was about 60 years old. And it had 23 people, and it was still $1 million in debt. Now, that's just not a good picture. You can imagine 53 people trying to pay off $1 million of debt, and they weren't always 53 people. They'd had some glory years, and they were still wanting to go back to those. And they had some great pastors before then, and then they had me, and I'm 24. And I'm thinking, they wanted me because I was 24 and I had 2 kids. And my first Sunday in the nursery, it was my 2 kids and one other baby in the nursery. So we had 3 kids. So they wanted me because I changed the demographic a little bit. And I remember this guy's name was Bill. I don't want to tell you his last name because somebody might be watching. And when he died, I always wondered, have you ever had people that said, I don't know. I'm leaving that up to God because I wasn't sure. Because Bill comes up to me and he says to me, you won't last 6 months. I'll give you 6 months. You're a kid. You're never going to make it. Well, I outlasted him, and I lasted for 27 years, but it wasn't because of him, I'll tell you that. It was because God gave me a little bit more hope than him. This guy wasn't giving me a chance, because here's the thing. At 24, I was going to make mistakes, and boy, did I make a lot of them. My worst one was I actually preached the book, 88 Reasons Why Jesus is Going to Come in 1988. I know you probably heard of the book. I preached it. I didn't know any better. It's like I'm 24. The book looks pretty good to me. It shows you where I was theologically. I got an earned doctorate after that just to prove that I could figure that part out, So I didn't know what I was doing in those days. 24 years old, still in school, trying to figure my way through. But last summer, the Holy Spirit tells me, I want you to transition your life's work into the hands of a younger person. I want to give this church another good run. Now we're not running 53, we're running over 3,000. We have over 5,000 members. And God says, I want you to walk away, I want you to become a kingdom builder, and I want you to transition this into the hands of a young man. And I found a 29-year-old. And I said, Lord, are you sure he's the one? He's the Joshua. I said, okay. So I called my elders. I had 32 elders and I had 34 deacons. And I called them around me and I said, listen, this is what the Holy Spirit's told me to do. I know that it doesn't make sense to anybody. It doesn't even really make good sense to me. But I'm doing it because God told me he needs me someplace else. And why are you doing this, Pastor? Well, the same reason I came here is the same reason I'm leaving here. God asked me to. That's the only answer I have. It's the only good answer I can give. But I said, here's what's going to happen. I need some spiritual fathers to gather around this young man because he is going to make mistakes. He's 29 years old. He's going to make some mistakes. And I want the spiritual mature to gather around him and let him make mistakes. I want you to restore him every time in the spirit of gentleness. And these guys said, we'll do it. And you know what? They gathered around him. I've been gone 9 months. They haven't lost any in attendance or finances. And to me, that's the greatest accomplishment that I could ever ask for, is the fact that it didn't fall apart after I left, that it's still going strong 9 months later under a 29-year-old leader who's never pastored a church in his life. But I want to tell you what, it wasn't necessarily because he knew everything. He was God's appointed, God's anointed. But the truth is, it's because they made a covenant relationship with me and him to say, we are going to handle any roadblocks we come into with the spirit of gentleness. And because of that one thing, they have a chance, and they will come into due season. I want to go to onto the second prerequisite. Let's go ahead and look at that. I'm going to skip one of the slides and go to the next one, if you will. Look at the second prerequisite. In order for them to arrive into due season, the congregation needs to understand that the leaders have to arrive in due season first. Okay? I don't know if you realize this, but whatever is going on in pastor's life is about to happen in your life. That's the way it works. If pastor's going through a spiritual battle, get ready, because it just comes right down. It starts at the head and just goes right down. If pastor is experiencing great levels of joy and victory, get ready. It's coming to your house next. That's how God works. That's the whole principle of Psalm 133, the anointing flowing from the beard of Aaron and down to the ground and onto the people. So in order for God to take a church into due season, the leadership of the church have got to come into due season first. If we become weary, we lose heart and we give up the dream. So look at what this passage says. It says that we can't lose heart because if we do, we won't arrive. So losing heart means I get discouraged. That means that I really wanted to do this, but I got discouraged and I can't do it. Or have heart means that somebody in my life is an encourager and they're keeping me going. I mean, there's going to be days that you're going to want to shoot yourself in the foot to feel better. Let's just be honest. But if you've got a good encourager in your life, that person's going to say, wait a minute, this is only a day. It's not your life. Keep going. Due seasons ahead. Keep going. There's better days ahead. And so we have to have courage in order to get into due season. I mean, if you're going to be good at anything in this world, you got to have courage. When I became a father, I fell in love with this baby, and I thought, I want to be a good dad, but I didn't have courage. I got every book I could find on being a father. I mean, I wore James Dobson out because I wanted to make sure I could get it right because I was so in love. I didn't want to mess it up. And I'm so glad I did. I had to find the courage to be a dad because I didn't feel like I was equipped very well. And I had to find the courage. Maybe you grew up in a home where you didn't feel like you were equipped very well, so you had to figure it out on your own. If you're going to be a leader, and here's the thing about ministry, everything God asks us to do in ministry, we don't know how to do. That's what makes it supernatural. That's when God takes the ordinary and makes it extraordinary. That's when God takes the natural and makes it supernatural. If God just asked me to do things I could already do, I would never need to pray. I would never need to fast. I would never need to worship. I would never need to lean on the everlasting arm. So God asked me to do things I can't do so that He can get the glory and He can stretch me in the right direction. So in the kingdom, that's the issue of kingdom work, is that almost every time God says, I want you to do something, you feel inadequate. Anybody ever experienced that besides me? I don't know how to do this, but that lets you know that it's God. You're in a God zone now because He's getting ready to grow you into a different person. So look at the next verse. Verse 6 says, let him who is taught the word. So how do we get, here's my question, how do we get the leadership of Heritage Fellowship Church? And I'm not just talking about the pastor, I'm talking about all the leadership. How do we get the leadership to due season so that the church can change this community and come into due season? An appointed time of blessing where finances are going to be released, where new relationships are going to be released. How do we get the church there? The first thing we have to do is we have to get the leadership there. So here's the principles He gave us. First off, He says, let him who is taught the word share in all good things with him who teaches. So here's the first principle. Don't wear out the teacher. The first principle is don't just take and never give back. So I'm not just going to pull from you all the time. Give me more, teach me this, and me never refresh you. So if you really want to, I tell churches this all the time, and that's why I love being a guest speaker, because I wanted pastors to come in and say this when I was the pastor, right? I tell them, if you see your pastor getting weary, send them on a vacation. Don't make them beg for it or ask for it. You step up and say, wait a minute. We're not going to let you get weary, because the last thing we need is a worn-out man of God trying to get us into heaven. We have to get to heaven on what you're preaching. We have to get our children saved on what you're preaching. We need someone who's refreshed. We want someone who can swing the battle axe. We want somebody who can carry the shield. We want someone who's excited, someone who is full of joy. And I cannot tell you, not your pastor, but I cannot tell you how many churches I've been to that the pastor is absolutely completely drained, worn out from over expectation and no encouragers in their life, and they're just running themselves ragged, and they get up, they drag themselves to the pulpit and preach, and I'm thinking, that is so counterproductive in the kingdom. That is so counterproductive. We are fighting hell. We are fighting the devil. We have got to have strong warriors. We've got to have strong leaders who can take us forward and do everything that God wants us to do. So the first principle is, don't let them wear out on your watch. First principle is this: take good care of whoever is bringing the word. Take good care of them. I don't want to take something, and it's like David. Ornan wanted to give him his threshing floor, and he said, I will not give God something that costs me nothing. I'm not going to be that way. If I'm receiving, I'm going to give back. So that's the first principle. Let him who has taught the word share in all good things with him who teaches. And then he goes into this passage there where he talks about whatever you sow, that's what you reap. So he says, if you sow to the flesh, you reap of the flesh. If you sow to the Spirit, you reap of the Spirit. So that means if I've got a man of God praying for me, I want to pray for that man of God. If I've got someone sowing encouragement into me, I want to sow encouragement into them. If I've got someone teaching me principles, I want to share a good book with them every now and then. I want to put back into them whatever I'm receiving. I want to put some of that back into them so that I have a good, strong leader in front of me. And then he says, verse 9, let us not grow weary while doing good, for in due season, everybody say due season, we shall reap if we do not lose heart. And then he says in verse 10, therefore, if we have the opportunity, let us do good, but especially to those who are of the household of faith. I want you to go to the next slide. I want to show you a passage in the Scripture that we have to pay attention to. Now, I realize for all of you Bible scholars and theologians, you're going to pick up on this real quick. You're going to read this and say, wait a minute, this has to do with the spirit of the Antichrist. And I get that, right? But the spirit of the Antichrist is already here. How many of you know that? The Antichrist is not in power, but the spirit of the Antichrist is already here. So in dealing with the spirit of the Antichrist, listen to what Daniel 7:25 says. It says, and he shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times. Wow. Is it possible for a spiritual attack to come against my life, and I get so worn out that it changes my time? Is it possible that I just got too tired to keep going, and I didn't finish what God was starting in me? Is it possible? How many of you know that sometimes the saints just get wore out? It's not that they don't love God. It's just they are worn out. And let me tell you something. This life right now can wear you out. We think it got easier with all of our modern technology. No, man, it was easier when we only had 3 channels on the TV set, right? And we didn't have remote control. I was the remote control. I would go outside and my dad would say, turn it to the left. And I'd turn or get the rabbit ears and add more tin foil. I mean, that was simple times. Nowadays, we never had to return a phone call all day long because we had a party line. Now, I'm telling on myself now. You know I'm from Greenville, Tennessee now. We had a party line, and you could get on the phone sometime unless you had a talker neighbor, and then you couldn't even get on your phone. Then we had these things called answering machines, but even then we only had to answer the phone once a day at the end of the day and return the phone calls. Now we got them. We can't even go anywhere. I don't even want to say where we go with our phones now because we take them everywhere. We feel guilty if we don't have our phone in our hand. How many phone calls are we taking now? How many text messages are we sending now? How many messages on social media are we doing now? No, it's not that one time a day anymore. We are busy, busy, busy. Every part of our life is busy. So all we need is a little spiritual attack to wear us down, and it can change our time and change our season. A few years ago, I had a pastor call me. If you go to the next slide. A few years ago, I had a pastor in Georgia call me, and he said, Brian, I'm going to leave my wife, and I'm going to leave my church. This guy's church was running about 700 people. And I said, why are you doing that? He said, I'm done. I'm wore out. I'm tired. I can't do it anymore. And I said, why are you calling me? What can I do to help you? He said, a few years ago, you were preaching at a convention, and you preached a sermon to pastors, and you took off your coat, and you had a bloody shirt on. You preached a message called Stricken Shepherds and Scattered Sheep. And it was from the passage in Zechariah, if you strike the shepherd, the sheep will scatter. And he said, I just felt like if I called you, you would be one of the guys who wouldn't judge me for how I'm feeling right now, because I'm just that hurt. And I said, I said, well, I said, the only thing I can think to do is I have a book called Where Are the Armor Bearers? I said, let me send you 10 copies of Where Are the Armor Bearers? And I want you to choose 10 faithful people in your church and ask them to read the book. And because I know I went away to a cabin and cried literally for days writing this book. God gave me the heart of brokenness so that I could feel the pain of ministry. And that's what the whole book is about. It's about building a spiritual support system around leaders so that we do not get weary in well-doing. And I had this, I sent him 10 copies of the book. I said, have these 10 individuals to read it and then come together next Saturday and discuss it, but you cannot be there when they do. They have to be able to talk freely. He said, I don't know how that's going to help. I said, don't leave your wife. Don't leave your church. Just do this. So I sent them to him. I overnighted them to him. He gave them to these people. About a week or so later, he called me weeping. He said, Brian, you're never going to guess what happened. He said, these people that read this book, they met on Saturday morning to discuss the book, and then they all came to my door. I was sitting at my house in my lazy boy. He said they rang the doorbell, and they came in the door crying. They went to our kitchen and brought a dishpan, and they washed my feet and wept over me and said, we are sorry that we let you wear out. We see it now. We get it now. We apologize for letting you get so weary on our watch. You were preaching to us and taking care of us. We should have been taking better care of you. This guy is still at that church. That church has doubled, and I had the privilege of preaching for him a couple of months ago. And I never told anybody the story. I've never told anybody in my whole life who it was that gave me that call, because it was a private moment. But I was so thrilled to tell you that that's been 10 years ago. He is still there. The church has doubled. His marriage is better than ever. And this guy is refreshed because God anointed someone to take care of leadership so leadership could lead. It made a huge difference. A huge difference. Go to the next screen, if you will. I love this scene from Gladiator. Anybody like the movie Gladiator? I don't know if I should be telling that in church, but I love it. You know, every now and then I just got to see a little blood and something, to keep me going. I know that's probably, I've just talked about gentleness, and now I'm talking about I got to get my blood flowing. I mean, I've got all girls in my family. I've got all daughters, all granddaughters. I've got 2 sons-in-laws. That keeps me going. Even the dogs are girls. So I've watched a lot of chick flicks in my life. So every now and then I just got to see somebody draw a sword. Just something, give me something, because I can't smooch anymore. I got to have something else here to get my blood going. I love this scene in Gladiator because if you've ever seen this movie, this guy pledges himself to the captain. He's not even a part of, this guy has been ousted by his king. He's been duped by his officers, but this guy who's a foreigner, a slave, pledges himself to be his armor bearer until he is restored. And he fights battles behind him all the time to restore him. I want to do one quick illustration, and I'm not going to take much longer. I don't know what time you usually get out, but I know I don't want to go too long. But can I borrow you, Robert? I know you've got the right spirit for this illustration, so I appreciate that. When I wrote the book Armor Bearers, I wasn't really sure what an armor bearer was, because the Lord was teaching me what it was. And when God showed me this, I realized that the purpose for armor bearers in the Old Testament was to do one thing: bring a king back from battle. The kings would have to go into battle, and the kings really didn't fight the battle. They would shine up their armors really shiny so they would glisten. So you see these kings in all these flamboyant colors and shiny garments, because they would bring them in on a chariot, and it would encourage the army to fight. It would also intimidate the enemy. The shinier the suit was of the officer, the more intimidated the enemy was, because they realized that there was a leader that was leading that army. And so they did not want, they knew a leaderless army would not march. So they wanted the leader to be prominent. So they would bring him in, and he had an armor bearer. And the armor bearer's job on the day of the battle was to drive the chariot. So he would go and shine up the armory, or the armor rather, of the officer, and then he would get in the chariot and say, "Now I want you to be refreshed, because when we get to the battle, that's when I'm bringing you there for a reason. And my job, I only have honor." And the armor bearer's family lived in the castle. They ate at the king's table. The only way he kept his job is to bring honor to the king and to bring the officer back. Now, it wasn't just the kings that had armor bearers. There was also other officers, generals in the army had the same thing. So on the day of the battle, he would drive the chariot through the lines of the battle, breaking the ranks, intimidating the enemies, and the armies would cheer because their leader was there, and it would encourage them to fight all the harder. But every now and then, the enemy would approach the chariot, and the leader had to fight. When the leader had to fight, the job of the armor bearer was to get at his back. So if you'll stay right there, I promise this won't hurt. He had to get at his back because he realized that the armor only protected him in the front, and the armor bearer was there to protect his back. The armor bearer was trained, and just follow me here, wherever the officer moved, he moved with him. So you saw this team, so that if the officer ever had to get down and fight, the armor bearer was not trying to win the battle, he was trying to protect the back of the officer. The whole time he would fight, the armor bearer would stand at his back and say, "Not on my watch. You are not taking this man out on my watch. This army needs him to run. We need him to lead, and I'm going to stay at his back the whole time we're here, because you're not going. I'm bringing him back alive." That's the armor that I have. That's the honor that I have. I have to bring him back alive. When the Lord showed me that, I knew that I needed that. I was a young man in ministry. I told you earlier, I had 53 people. I had a huge debt. I had a church that the snow had collapsed the roof on the educational wing, and we were just barely getting by. They had piled up the baptistry full of all kinds of things. They were using it as a storage room because no one had been baptized in years. And I'm standing there thinking, what in the world am I going to do? I thought I could come here because I needed to finish my master's degree. And I didn't know I was going to get into this. They came to me. I remember Sister Pearl was her name. She comes to me and she says, "Pastor," they all called me Pastor B. "Pastor B, we can't pay you this month, but we're going to bring some groceries and we're going to pay your car payment because we just can't do it. Maybe next month we can." And I said, "Okay, if that's how it is." And I remember going before God saying, "Okay, God, how am I going to do this?" I got so discouraged. All of my family from Tennessee, all the people in Tennessee said, "You've gone to misery, not Missouri. You've gone to misery. And why are you doing this to your family? Why are you doing this to your wife and now your 2 little babies?" And I said, "I know it sounds crazy, but God told me to. And I know it doesn't make sense, but God told me to." And I want you to go 2 more slides. I want you to go to the one that shows the church and the old men. There you go. This man's name is D.J. Haynes. He's now in heaven. He had just retired from the military and then retired as a truck driver. Left the military, drove trucks for a living, didn't get a chance to finish his education. All of his education was from the Marines. This guy was a rough guy. He came to me one day and he said, "Pastor B, I don't understand what this means, but God told me to be your man." I said, "Dave, I don't like the sound of that." I said, "What does that mean?" He said, "I don't know, but God told me that whatever you do, I'm supposed to make sure that whatever's in your heart gets done." I said, "Well, Dave, we'll have to figure this out as we go." He'd show up to the church. He'd say, "Pastor, I'm here to pray. You want to pray together?" Yeah, and I'm telling you, this man, he was a rough guy. He's a military guy. This man could pray. I mean, he threatened every devil in the county. He could out-pray me 10-1. I mean, I felt intimidated praying around this guy because he was good and I was horrible. And I was like, wow, that's how praying is. And you know what? I find myself praying like Dave now. I started doing missions work. I went to El Salvador. And when I went to El Salvador, Dave said, I'm going with you. And I'm standing out there in Santa Tecla, El Salvador, teaching pastors and preaching at this old convention. This swarm of wasps come in the building. This is a few years into our journey. This guy was my armor bearer for of the 27 years. He started in my second year. He did this for 25 years. I buried him the last year before I left. And at the age of 87, I buried him. This guy went on every trip, almost every missions trip that I went on for years. And I led over 30 missions trips just to Central America, and he went on every single one of them. We were in El Salvador one time, and this swarm of wasps come in the room, and they were coming to sting me. And Dave stepped out in front of the wasp so they would sting him instead of stinging me. I said, Dave, what are you doing? He said, I told your wife I'd bring you back alive. And I told God that. And when those wasps got near that mighty man of prayer, he just said one word, I curse you in Jesus' name. That's all he said. And guys, it was like something straight out of the Bible. I'm not kidding you. I've never seen, this guy was not a preacher. He was not ordained. He didn't have license. I saw those wasps go around him in a circle, attach themselves to the pulpit, and die. We took a putty knife and scraped them off the pulpit. About 2 years later, we were back in El Salvador building a church. We were in the drought season. And we were trying to build this church for this blind pastor there. And because of the drought, we had run out of water. We had these barrels of water, and we couldn't mix any more cement. And the team, you know how it is when you get a lot of Americans and on the trips like that, and they were impatient because we were used to running to Lowe's, right? Get on your cell phone, call in the sand. You can't do that there. You got to dig the sand out of the river and carry the water, all this stuff. It's a whole lot different. And so I remember we ran out of water, and Dave said, do you mean to tell me, Pastor, that God sent us down here to build this church, and we're going to stop this building project because of water? I said, well, Dave, what are we supposed to do? He said, well, just do what Elijah did. Call it in. He stopped the whole work team. We had 37 on that trip. I'll never forget it. He said, in the name of Jesus, I call in the rain from the north, the south, the east, and west. David Peraza was the overseer at the time, and he says, Brian, I just want to tell you, I've lived here 54 years. It's never once rained in this month of the year. I don't want you to get your hopes up. I said, what are we going to do, David? He said, I don't know. So we go back to the camp. That night, about 2 o'clock in the morning, I heard God's limousines roll in. Those black clouds came into Santa Tecla, El Salvador, or whatever city, San Jose, I think is where we're at. Those clouds came in, and there was the biggest downpour of rain you've ever seen in your life. It scared David Peraza, the overseer, so bad, he ran 2 miles from his house to our camp and said, this is a miracle. He said, I've never once seen it rain in this season of the year. And I said, you think it'll be enough rain to finish the project? We went out to the campsite the next morning. We had these barrels, and it only rained about 20 minutes. And from a 20-minute rain, you might have caught a little water. All of our barrels were all the way to the top. It was like it caught the downpour because this man of God prayed. I cannot tell you how many times I would have quit, and this old man would come up to me and pray the very prayer that I needed to pray. People give me a lot of credit for building such a great church in the Midwest. But I got to tell you, I know who's really the wind beneath the wings. It wasn't me. I led it, but it was DJ Haynes and Donna Jones and Rabin Froud and Rawton Narain. It was Elmer E. Rudy. It was people that God put in my life that said, if the leader doesn't arrive first, we cannot come into due season. We want to make sure you get us there. And I want to tell you, that church went from 53 struggling people and no debt to a church of over 5,000 members. And when I left there, they had a couple of million in the bank, so I think they're doing okay. And now they have a 29-year-old pastor who is leading them full steam ahead into another great season, all because of the glory of God. There's a promise hanging over your church, a promise of due season. And God says spiritually mature people are going to get you there. But we got to get your leaders there first.